So, first of all, thank you very much for all the speakers, and I guess now we can start the discussion. Basically, what personally I understood is that there are so many successful experiences that when they will all be achieved, I mean, the question remains, is this a danger for museum goers or for museums themselves, or is it all of these are opportunities for museums? That's really the main question. I'm thinking we spoke about 2050 and to launch a discussion about that. In 2050, if I am a young adult and I'm walking on the street, if I see a museum, am I going to want to go inside, or I'm just going to say to my friend, oh, this is where they store artworks? Because I will see it virtually, I will experience it in any way possible. So do I still have the motivation to get inside? So that's the question, the discussion I would like to start with. And maybe the floor is open for... And as we said before, if anyone wants to ask a question or to intervene in the middle, please raise your hand as well. Thank you.
I don't know, maybe just to start with, I think museums don't have to fear that much all of these different developments as long as they remain aware of the fact that they hold a certain expertise on the heritage that is still completely valid. And most of what we saw tonight is basically tools that enable a wider range of people to navigate this heritage more easily from like all of the connectivity that Google allows with its different technologies to other things, to buildings that architects like Bake create. It's really, of course, some museums, some institutions will freak out and say, oh, Google is coming to sort of take away our heritage and put it in one massive database where we don't know if we will still have access. Maybe Big will turn our museums into physical playgrounds, etc. EPFL is going to destroy something else. But what is still there is that expertise where you say all of these tools, if you properly position them and you take them as storytelling tools and networking tools for cultural data, and you put your experts on it, you have them learn the tools and know more about these technological elements, then I think there's really a good situation for everyone involved there.
Yeah, I think maybe to take another look here, I think that whether it's a Google Glass experience or the Here experience or the design of the really incredible space, I think everybody's talking about experience and offering new, inaccessible, surprising, illuminating experience that's really broadening our understanding really of culture and redefining culture. So I feel as if that, as you mentioned, I think the tools are critical, but especially we're talking about museums becoming experientially rich environments that are attracting all generations in pretty experimental ways. I mean, just listen to what's going on here, and I think it includes the design of the building, but it's mobile.
I think that people are traveling more and more. I mean, even though we can travel on Google and we can go somewhere, at least I, as an architect, I've never traveled more than I do now, and I've never gotten an understanding of building something in a new place by just visiting it virtually. Even though the virtual reality is getting closer and closer, it still is very different. It's a supplement to also going there. But it's a little bit like Skyping, that if you've met people in real life, then Skyping with them is extremely easy. But if you've never met them in real life, it can be really hard because you don't get that extra amount of information that is in the physical world. And I think it's going to take a very long time. And I think that's what museums are. And that's what they need to focus on, is that they are different than the virtual experience. and that it's a real experience of something that is, and I think for a long time, at least to my experience, there was focus from many museums to go more and more digital, and I have the feeling that it's a little bit stopping, and maybe it's going in the other direction, because you simply cannot update your technology fast enough to follow up with people changing the computers and going into virtual reality. So I think that thinking of what is it actually that that makes museums different is that they are part of the real world, and then really focusing on that.
Yeah, so I think there's actually many indications today that I mean, usually sort of every cultural sort of progress also has sort of the opposite of it, and there are real indications today that sort of the increasing digitalization of what we do and what we're confronted with is actually having also the effect that sort of the real thing is becoming more and more relevant. Just thinking of this project around Polaroid, what's it called again? The guys who, I think, isn't it? I know it's in Holland actually. They built up the old Polaroid factory again to produce Polaroid, film. And because people started to sort of increasingly use the old Polaroid cameras again, which sort of got out of business because of digital cameras. Yeah, so there's sort of this anti-movement. And I think with museums, it's pretty clear that sort of the more digital our world will become, the more relevant there will be museums and the real thing and the real picture. Yeah? However, one thing that we should really consider is that people are increasingly getting now confronted with new things. So the attention span and the sort of the competition for attention of the audience is massive.
Yeah, I don't know that the question is whether there's a value of a space or a magical space. I think you're right about physical versus virtual, but for me the question is what goes on there actually, and why do I go back? You know, and I think that the space is great, but it's got to embrace a meaningful activity that I feel is culturally relevant, and my feeling in terms of the virtual and non-virtual. So I think what's going on is that nothing. Back when we were talking about e-books replacing books, the fact is we're diversifying. Nothing's really replacing anything. Actually, there's just this much broader kind of range of spaces. So I feel that what's going to happen probably in space is virtual and real, and it all is going to be mixing. It's my guess, but the real question for me is what happens actually. What is the content actually? I think that's the question.
Maybe two more things. First, I kind of agree that nothing replaces the physical experience. I think being part of the conversation online, being part of what is available, putting some collection online, sharing, creating an online community is a way for a museum to create some desire, to be part of this competition that everybody's fighting for attention today. And I think also we should not forget people who are not as lucky as we are and who can't travel or can't travel everywhere. And they have the right to get access to information, knowledge, art, in a way that might not be the ideal one. Maybe the ultimate experience will always be the epiphany in front of a masterpiece in a beautiful museum, but maybe it's not possible for everybody. I can't visit all the museums of the world in the remaining time of my life, so I'm happy to be able to access some of this experience online.
You were talking about that it all becomes about experiences. And with the advancement of technology, experience becomes more and more individualized. All this participatory culture, and basically the audience wanting more and more to become, co-creators, co-curators, kind of, Joseph Beuys' idea of everyone is an artist. So how does that, translate into, the future of museums? If everybody is an artist, if everybody is curator, then how can you actually institutionalize it? Or would you?
Well, that's a big, long question, but just to maybe attack a few parts of it, I think that institutions, the way we've thought about them for the last several hundred years, are sort of going out of business. So I think that thinking of a museum as an institution, from my point of view, is maybe not a great idea. I think that the future of organizations is evolutionary. And I think that it's definitely collectively defined, and it's always true. The Louvre is definitely the 9 million people who go through it, and some of the farce of the Louvre is the 9 million people who are running through it at any given moment. So I think that increasingly people are, and we see it across the board, not only online, but in physical reality as well. Increasingly, we're all sort of participating in the co-creation. I think that there are hierarchies of meaning, and we're all at different stages in our own lives, and so I think that the notion of the artist will, from my mind, always exist and sort of step out from, unfortunately, whoever we are, however artistic we are, we have those banal moments and those banal days and those banal years, and I think that the rarefied moment of the aesthetic experience that we were talking about before, where we sort of step out of the moment and we're actually resonating with something that's universal, is pretty rare. And those institutions or those museums that are managed to curate that will really, I think, own the future of culture. But my feeling is it's going to be much more evolutionary than it's been.
So one other question that I'm always asking myself is, when at this point, when you have a telephone, you have also a computer, you have a camera, you have a personal assistant, you have a television, you have a cinema, and I'm wondering, can a museum just be a museum? Is this enough? I mean, really.
I have the feeling that museums have been through a lot of revolutions already. The concept, at least, of the Western Universal Museum, end of the 18th century. They've been through a lot for the past 2 centuries, so I'm pretty convinced they will cope with what's coming now. And I think that, and there I agree with you, I think they have a singularity. There was a very interesting study in the north of France by the region policymakers around which speech is trusted today. And policymakers, media, big companies, everybody was very low in terms of trust, and museums were very high. They were not commissioning this study, but they were part of the questions. And I think that's extremely precious for museums to be ranked as super trustworthy institutions today. And I think it's extremely useful in the coming years.
Trustworthy in what sense? Because, well, we speak about, for example, Europe, and we say, okay, well, there's original artworks, and then you can trust that when you go, you see an original experience. If you work in museums like we do in China or in India, so it's, let's say, 2/3 of the world population, they don't really care about the original artwork. I mean, for them, they always say, well, if the copy is as good as the original, then it's okay if we have only the copies in our museum. So basically, this authenticity of this trust has also sort of a limit.
And even you must be aware of, I don't know how many people have been to the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Los Angeles, but it's one of the most incredible museums. So Jurassic technology that just sort of was a good idea at the time, but it turned out to be a bad idea. And it's the most phenomenal museum, super weird. And there are things that are exhibited that never really happened, actually. And so it's completely weird. And it's an institution. You know, it's a pretty amazing, very postmodern museum.
But I think in general that trust that museums are still afforded is because they're still seen as institutions that allow you to make connections between content. And of course, some of them can be pretty dictatorial in ways. They show you stuff. I mean, I don't know. You look at war museums all over the world. You'll always get very different views and very one-sided views on whatever happened during World War II or so. But in general, typically an art museum or a science museum allows you to still sort of put elements out there and say, look, this is actually connected to this. You can take a look at that connection, or you can not be interested. We offer you another pathway, and so forth. And this is very important. And I think all these elements we're developing, they're just enabling this navigation to become faster and more efficient. And also, again, to sort of take that reference of that contemporary museum client who would walk in and would want only what he wants out of that museum. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to be sort of a selfie museum, basically, that it's all going to be centered around oneself. Some people maybe will like sort of draw very close circles to their own persona, but others will take the opportunity and say, okay, you allow me to look at this and you show me this connection, okay, I'll follow it, and then you can sort of build your worldview out of this. And I think this role of museum, that's still very much out there, and it's only going to be amplified.
Thank you so much for allowing us to get into the discussion. So what struck me obviously is this conversation about the experience economy, which Pine and Gilmore already wrote about in the late 90s as a new business model. And there seems to be a kind of fetishization of this experience economy with very little critical awareness of the way that it might have to be mediated. And I'm wondering, in all of your tools, platforms, hubs, and all of these innovative networks, how are you providing the kind of critical tools for the users, the customers, the influencers, the tribes? How are you providing a kind of critical a reflection on the critical mediation? Can I, please? A reflection on the critical mediation, which is equally important. So part of the content is to think about the critical technology and the critical mediation. And I would love to just hear from, each one of you how this is done in your particular laboratory.
I think they're all tools, and they're not tools that are dumped on cultural institutions and sort of overtaking them. That only happens if management panics and says, okay, we need a complete overhaul and we're going to get a communications agency in to completely rehaul the museum, etc. I mean, as long as institutions trust their own competency with their own content, then they will see that these tools can be powerful for them, that they can endow them with their own critical perspective on the content. And I think none of us is in a position where we want to just impose our views on a specific content through the tools we provide to read that content. And that's a frontier that needs to be respected, I guess.
And just to speak to our model and to make a couple observations. So we're interested in experimentation at the frontier. And it happens to be that people are interested in going there right now. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But just to step back, there's a real broad perception right now, maybe especially in the young generation, that the older generation really doesn't know where the world's going. If you look at what's on television, what people are watching, what people are playing in terms of games, it's a lot of reality, it's a lot of experience, a lot of discovery, it's a lot of open-endedness, and it's a lot of self-generated also content, a lot. People are interested in kind of the boundaries of experience right now and are much less interested, the younger generation, much less interested in answers, actually, and in connecting. So that just happens to be going, and I think it has to do with the fact that people are a bit, maybe afraid on the negative side and also sort of fascinated on the other side, but there's an openness right now that I think is just frankly related to the fact that we're facing lots of challenges and change and so on and so forth. So that's, I think, from a demand point of view, one of the things that's going on in culture right now. So those who are at frontiers, there's always been those at frontiers who are experimenting, and they've tended to be pretty marginal. and actually joined in a very rare kind of circumstance. And those folks now find themselves with people. It's like all the people who are going up the Himalayas in their 2 weeks, and I was like, they're all going there. There's a lot of interest in being at that frontier. And so the question that we ask is, well, what is it that's interesting in what's going on at a frontier? Why would anybody want to come here, actually? And so people seem to be interested in actually having the experience of the frontier, sort of feeling the ambiguity of the frontier. And so we spent a lot of time just thinking about how do we curate that experience. So we're not really in a tool mode. We're more in an authentic experiment at a frontier and opening that up as much as we can. And what we found is that the more sensorial our experience can be, the better. The less binary that experience can be, the better. And so we spend a lot of time just thinking about how do we provoke sensorial, full aesthetic interaction at the frontier, which is kind of not an answer to your question, but I think that one of the slippery things, it maybe gets to our ability to analyze really what's going on, is that quite a bit of activity in culture right now is happening at these sort of edgy frontiers where it's maybe harder to step out and say, well, who's the observer and who's the actor?
But I mean, usually, so this stuff, I think it's really, really important to distinguish. I mean, so one thing, there is museums, right? And I don't know actually why they were built first place. I guess it's pretty clear why, but I guess it's to put some stuff into a house. No, joking. But anyways, there's always a reason for that, right? For a museum. The other thing is now sort of what happens when we think of a museum as an experiential place, like what you were saying before. And I would say, sort of from an experiential relevance, it was always more important to see galleries than museums. I don't know, I think there's a difference between museums and galleries. Museums is like stuff that, has some kind of meaning and it has some kind of cultural meaning. Gallery, for me, the role of a gallery used to be more on an experiential side and maybe on an experimental side as well. Yeah? And now this experimental side of the galleries or of the labs are now also swapping into the virtual space. That's what's happening here in Google Labs, in whatever your lab, in some of my work and so on. And if you think of this experimental work as something that's right out there at the frontier, how you call it, you could compare it in the digital world. We have now, this is like experimental physics. Yeah, that sort of the results of experimental physics are then sort of applied in applied physics, and at some point going to end up in some kind of rockets or machines or whatever. What we're doing, we're at the experimental sort of arts or culture or whatever in the digital, and that has sort of a relevance in the applied sort of digital space, right? It's the same process, and once it's applied, it might go big or it might go not big, and when it gets big, then, of course, you have all these questions about mediation of the whole process. I mean, whatever, the 3D technology, great, yeah? And then someone puts war games in there and I don't know what, and we have to protect our kids from it. That's really the phase that comes after, I think, a lot of the work that we're doing.
Yeah, totally. From our standpoint, we're a tech company, so and we're convinced we have no expertise in art and culture. So we never curate the content or even decide what type of collection should be published. Or we build tools. We're kind of opportunistic in the sense that sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Sometimes we are extremely surprised with the result and who will take them and build something in terms of content and experience that we have never thought about. But the thing is, we are a platform. So we do work in a collaborative way. It's really at the heart of the project in the sense that most of our partners share with us some requests. In terms of storytelling, we need this type of features. And then we will try to build them and we will test them and see if it was a good idea or not. But we do not curate the content.
I'd just like to make a point. You guys started talking about 2050, that's some time ahead of us. If you think about the younger generations, people from 10 years onwards, not enough's being done really. In museums, more and more is being done. At the Guggenheim, for instance, they had a study comparing kids from 10 to 14, which did education programs in the museum with those which didn't. And the guys which did the education programs had 5% better notes in writing and reading. And I think that's quite staggering. And not enough is done nowadays to stop distracting kids with the usual entertainment, music and stuff like that, and open some kind of fields to them, some paths which are accessible to their age to learn more about museums. Good museums do that to a certain extent, but in the virtual field, there's not too much of it for that age group.
I would like actually to add to maybe speak with ask David Edwards, because you're teaching in Harvard, and also it's again about the kids, because you are speaking about, I understand that information you can find somewhere. Information you can find, I totally agree about experience.
Yeah.
That information, we don't need to provide information anymore, it's there. Yeah. And we need to provide experience, but sometimes, and actually very often now, experience is a trick. You know, like in art as well, rain room, it's beautiful, but it's a trick, and people will go there because they quickly click what it is. And they like this experience, but it's a kind of, you know, on the tricky side. How you make them feel, because experience is different between make them feel.
So, okay, so...
You know what I mean? You're speaking about sensory, you know, sensory stuff, so it's...
So just... I will say a few words to address what I think was kind of a general question. Well, just to comment about Harvard right now and about learning and about actually these questions of distraction and depth versus superficiality and what is learning tomorrow and why should we be trying to curate it. There's a real awareness, not just at Harvard, obviously, in general right now. At Harvard, so we have the sort of the commoditization of knowledge, which is happening through our education programs, where we're just like educating hundreds of thousands of people. And so the information that was the value of going to a university 800 years ago is no longer the reason why you go to the university. So there's a big change, and frankly, it's related to museums as it is related to universities. So the discussion on campus, literally just earlier this week, I was speaking to people high in the administration and talking about, and we talked about it earlier, training young people for a jobless future. And now that doesn't mean, oh, you're all going to be out of a job, although if we don't do our job, they will be. But it's more, it has to do with the idea that actually, to be extreme, all of the jobs that exist today are kind of going away. In other words, we really need young people who are entrepreneurial, but not in that I want to make money, but entrepreneurial in that I'm really paying attention, and I'm listening, and I care what you think, and I'm sort of putting myself in your position. I'm doing something that's going to benefit us both, right? And so that notion of a caring, thoughtful person is what anybody who's recruiting students out of a university is looking for right now, is that very thoughtful. And now we're getting to this aesthetic kind of life that we want young people to kind of grow up. And it's a non-distracted, I'm paying attention, I'm listening, I care. How do we create that? And it's not that it is irrelevant to teach Goethe or Shakespeare, not at all, or teach calculus. But there is an experience, a profound, deep, connected experience that we need to give young people. And it's pretty clear that it's connected to culture and the creation of culture. So I think that And there's no simple answer right now, but there's a lot of discussion about it, and there is a lot of making going on campuses right now, a lot of collective sort of experience that's happening, and people thinking about, well, how do we, so the last thing I want to say, though, is we're clearly in a transitional phase. And if anybody up here was to say, this is the future of the museum, you should just not listen, because it's really transitional. And I think that the important thing is that we are experimenting, and I think in all of our cultural context, we need to have that happening, and probably will plane out to something that makes sense, but it's not obvious to me what that is right now.
I just want to. I mean, it's very banal, and it's basically what you're all saying, and I think that's what your problem in general is. There's so much information. There's information everywhere, and I think that the more you get aware that what you need to do, like, it's the curating. It's the fewer things, the better. Because like searching through information, you can do your home. You can do it home. So what you need to do is you need to think about how, by going to a museum, do you become better at choosing and saying no to the 10 million things. And you do that by doing that yourself, so that the museum is a place where the choice is so sharp, and there's so like the fewer things, the better. And I think in many ways, because that's what love is, or that's what parenting is. That is really helping people to learn how to choose. And I think that there's images everywhere. You know, we get bombarded with images, and I think what is a luxury is time to focus on very few things and being immersive and actually, and so the experience nature, I think, is a little. It sounds a little superficial somehow. But I do think the real experience is spending more time on fewer things, and because that's what we all know was things that changed our own lives. It's few things. It's not the conglomeration of more and more knowledge. It's actually the few experiences that you remember specifically that turned your life around. And I think that's what you want to aim at.
So you would still link the museum to the actual physical location?
Definitely.
And an object? Because a lot of what we've discussed here sort of positions the museums of the future as producers of content, of meaning, rather than, actual physical locations, like navigation, like experience, like creating a lab for, to foster creative thinking. So this is something that is kind of, location free, but now you're talking still about, a specific place, specific venue, and a link to an object or...
Yeah, I mean, for me it's very physical, but I think that's what we do. I think that's also what Google does, is that they give people free, but it's actually the choice of the few things that they do and that they choose to do, because there must be like a gazillion ideas floating around, and if you pursue them all, you pursue none. And I think, at least for us also, when we work with architecture, it's the choice of what you do, because we do 10 million studies of should a building look like this, or like this, or like this, or like this. And it's not the study, it's not the amount of information that you produce or that you consider that makes the real thing. It's the choices that you make.
Yeah, and I think that what Laurent said earlier about trustworthiness and really what's being said here right now, I think the museum, whether you're talking about information or experience, the filter nature of the museum, the ability to selectively choose in a non sort of self-interested way, but so I think that role of filter is major, and it's bigger than before because there is so much information out there. But I don't think we're saying that there's not a role for space specific at all. I think that the notion that there's a Mona Lisa in the Louvre and you got to go to the Louvre for the Mona Lisa, we're probably out of that world where I think that experience is less owned by an institution than objects were owned in the past, in a way.
I do have another question. Just coming back to a few experiences, how would you deal with the relevance of information? With the loads of information everywhere, how would you understand which choices to make? Because you said like you need a few choices. How to make them? And how institutions help in this, and how technologies is thinking about it?
That's
it's
a
a question to all of you, actually.
No, I mean specific. I really believe that historically the museum was the collector of knowledge, the collector of objects. The church was the frozen history of the past because people did not have access to information, and now we are in a situation where there is information. But how you learn people if that's your question? I think you learn them by showing them right choices. I mean,
whose
that's
choices
super vague.
are that?
Yeah, but
in the church, it was
I know that's super vague, but I think you can't answer the question on how you do it because that's an individual from each.
Exactly.
Yeah,
because
from
Hermitage
each
is
situation.
Catherine the Great choices. So we go to Hermitage in St. Petersburg and we see the choice of exactly one person, and then it was additions, right? Or we go to the church, it is a religious choice.
So I think that it gets back to the. So I think that the relevance of the museum, if you will, is associated with the care and the aesthetic attention that the museum and the curators and ultimately the artists take in observing their moment. And I think that a contemporary art museum in 2032 in St. Petersburg will have a different choice of content, and it would be impossible for somebody sitting here in Vienna in 2016 to say what that is. But it has, we need people paying attention, right? We're no longer in the world where we could have the 10-year plan and that everybody could just kind of march along. So we need everybody paying attention. So I think that the mass culture, like the mass education phenomenon is kind of behind us. It's a much more, again, evolving, but it is, I don't think there's a mystery about how do we choose. It's like, how do you parent? You know, it's like, I wish there were like a really good book, but it's like every single moment calls for a different response, you know, and you just need to care and pay attention. And
yes, but if to go wider than museum or a culture, even how to read news, you know, something is happening, bombs, and there are hundreds of different places where this information is coming from, and you have 5 minutes to read about this, right, before you go to work in the morning. So how do you make your choice, which newspaper, which tweet, or which Facebook, or what to read? Only by the moment that you know this person, that's why you read it, or your parents were reading this newspaper. How is it working today?
yeah.
Can I say something? So I think what we're starting to realize now, I mean, you're getting bombarded with information. Why? Because internet and so on and so on. However, what we're starting to see now is that the internet is increasingly getting filtered. Like Google is introducing recommendation algorithms. Yeah, Facebook is having a recommendation algorithm. So basically, there are systems which, I mean, to say bluntly, are making the decision for you. Yeah, sounds really, really like a bad future, right? However, that's where we are at the moment, seriously. And there's an interesting book, The Filter Bubble, by Eli Pariser. You should read that, super interesting. However, now you can complain about this future, and I am the first one who's complaining about that, and I think we need to increase these filters. I totally increase these filters, and there's also, I think, a lot of really clever people working on this problem, on this specific problem in the technology side. But what you shouldn't forget is that sort of the real world that we're confronted with each day, and also education, is also filtered. I mean, what is put into the museum? Yeah, some curators put something into a museum which they thought is going to be of value. I mean, I'm not sure if that's your job in the end, but you know what I mean. It's also, I mean, what is taught in school is filtered. I mean, you know, if I look at just the recent history, what actually happened in Turkey, I have no clue. And if I read it up, a Wikipedia thing about the Turkish thing there, I don't get it. Yeah. So the whole world is filtered. There are filtering systems, curation systems, and I think that's one big part of the task of museums, that they're doing a good job in filtering, and we have to learn in the technological world to do the same.
And this again, we could go out all night here, but just to say that, the Museum of the Jurassic Technology is an interesting example. And take my son, who's 13 and grew up in Paris and now is in an American school, and he's in a really good school, and he just had his first math test, and he came home and he was very upset because the pages that he was studying, the teachers told him afterwards, oh, actually they were wrong. And so he said, well, how is that fair? I was in a French education where I had, and now, you know what, they gave me a book, and there were pages where actually the teacher said, no, it was actually wrong. And what clearly the teacher was trying to say was that, you know what, you need to actually, every source, you need to kind of, so unfortunately, I think we're in a world where, with filters, without filters, where there's no longer really this is where you need to go for the truth. I think so it's in a more relativistic, and we need, again, to be paying attention and looking at lots of sources. It's complicated.
I mean, I think the reason why the question is difficult is because basically I'm not a museum specialist and I'm not a behavioral specialist. I'm an architect. I specialize in taking decision in architecture, and I believe that by looking at how good people and talented people that use their lives taking decision within a very specific field, that's how you learn how to take your own decisions. So to broaden that out into the museum world is basically to say, by being able to understand why the museum took the decisions that it did, and it being the right decisions to be taken, then when people leave, they have learned something. I don't think I can say it any differently.
Thank you a lot.
I actually have a question for Dmitry Aksenov. Because it seems like it's a little bit off, but I live in New York, so you will know where it's coming from, because I don't see any women here deciding about the future.
Is it a question? Or?
Yes, it is a question. How did you choose all these men?
If you're addressing me, as I said, the initiative is really guided by Aksenov Family Foundation and Avesta Group. So the choice of the speakers was done by 50-50. But if you're asking me how I see future, not of the museums, but of our civilization, my belief is that the future belongs to women.
Exactly.
I mean, for me, it's no doubt, because look who is leading top 2 European economies. Okay. Who is the next president of US? Okay.
Hopefully.
But I mean, if you ask why, I think it's a pretty clear answer to me that women are more strategic. So they have, biologically, they have more complicated stuff to deliver. So 9 months, and then men here to enjoy life here and there, and that's it. And
I see that.
So I mean, that's my belief.
I agree 100%.
But I have a question, as if I'm here. So we are thinking about future of the museums. Okay, then we came up a bit with the topic of universities, education. But how much time do we have? Because you're talking about 2050. Sorry, my prediction is that yes, we're in transition period. Nobody knows. But what's the feeling? What's the gut feeling? How much time do we have until the whole thing will be dramatically, over? Like, you take financial industry. 3 years ago, the guy from Erste Foundation told me, you know what? In 2018, when the digital natives would have 50% of buying power, all the financial institutions, traditional financial institutions would be gone. 1/3 would be alive, they adapt. 1/3 would be, and now we see that fintech is dominating, and in 2 years it would be none of the existing top financial players in a similar format as it's now. So how do you see, say, culture? Because when I talk to this specific guy from Erste, we will talk about culture innovation. He said, culture innovation doesn't fit. No, I think it doesn't matter what you do, in what industry you are in now. Is it education, transportation, I don't know, writing? It's all will be, totally different future. But what's your opinion? How long time do we have?
Well, where's the singularity, guys, here? What is 2037? What's the number?
Yeah, I think that if we all get into the mode of figuring out what is that year, the year is next year. So I think that right now.
Last year.
What's that?
Last year.
Last year, yeah, that's probably okay. Well, whatever it is, it's close. But so this is a funny answer, but I think that in a way, from a culture point of view and certainly a creator point of view, never been a better time to be alive, in that everything's changing, right? And so there's kind of a real demand. It's a demand economy for creators, so that's really great. That puts a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of creators, and this conversation has just enormous relevance. And so I think it's a moment of great seriousness. And I think if we can have, and it's a funny thing to say, but I think if we can have fun right now and in transition, it's going to be painful, and there's a lot of issues of equality and all kinds of issues. It can be, the answer is almost irrelevant, but things are going to be changing really rapidly. I think the issue right now is how much, how do we hold together in rapidly changing times? Because that's pretty much happening right now. It's pretty much happening right now, yeah. So I think it's not now and then. It's this slope we're on, and it's if we can, and I think that culture has a major role to play, as you're pointing out, and I think people are recognizing it. It's an interesting moment.
It's true the times are changing, but like a university education still takes 5 years. It's taken that for the last more than a century. It's still taking 9 months before a baby comes out.
So can I jump in and say it's actually not 9 months anymore?
I'm like into architecture that things are 500 years old, 1,000 years old. I think basically things are changing a lot slower than we think, because we change very slowly as human beings, and we are the fundamentals. We are like the constant that cannot change.
I think it's a very good conclusion, well, I think it was very optimistic, and so I hope that everyone enjoyed as much as we did. So thank you very much again for coming, and thank you to the Aksenov Family Foundation and to everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Thank you.